Okay. Actually, I want to wait till the classes comes around so I can just sort of see who's here and what's happening. So the syllabus will, we have meetings every week. The 1 week that we have to reschedule on the Tuesday, the 17th. I have to be in New York for a convocation, so we'll work that out separately, and we can figure you can either do it that week at a different time or later in that week, actually, because I have to be in New York through Tuesday. Okay. All the material for the course is on chalk, so you should all know how to have an access to that. I think you should get the contact information from someone, and then all of that is on chalk. There are a couple of things that have not yet been put on towards the end of the term, and I'll set those things up. But the one book that I had hoped that you would have, you can see on page 2, the one by Yaus, called The Question and Answer, Forms of Dialogic Understanding. I was informed by the bookstore just about a few days ago that it doesn't, they can't order it, but there are several copies online. So if you do want to get that, I would strongly recommend that. Yaus is a very important both philosopher and comparative literature person in Europe, and there are a number of aspects of that book I think that you'd find quite interesting. I would also recommend, if you are involved in some of this, in Blanchot, the Infinite Conversation. I've only given you the chapter 2, but there are several other aspects that Blanchot deals with issues of the questions. So there should be 4 things here. So we're just going through the syllabus now.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think given the amount of people or the amount of people that might get it, I was told there may be a half dozen. It's at University of Minnesota. So you can probably get that if you want that, but that is on reserve as well. I should mention that the Blanchot and the that's just the syllabus. So you take one of each. Okay. So the Blanchot and the Yaus are also on reserve. Gadamer is also on reserve. Everything else, and the pages are also on chalk, so you can choose as you want. I did order the Gadamer for the other course that I'm doing tomorrow. So if that's something that interests you, there's a considerable amount. But already today we're going to read a section together that deals with the issue of the question, but it's a fundamental structure in his phenomenology as well. So the only other thing I just wanted to mention is that I would like, this is what I was ideally hoping for, 4 2-page prompt papers, so that you can respond either to primary or secondary issues. That's during the course of the entire term, and 1 10-page final paper. That can either come from material that we're dealing with, or if there is material that you want to supplement. So, for example, those of you who are interested in philosophy could supplement it with Gadamer or other people who deal with the issue of question, like Ricoeur or others. Those who are interested in comparative literature, the Yaus and so on, I can give you other kind of readings. And then those who want to follow up on certain kind of texts, like the rabbinic material, you can certainly do that. There's no presupposition. All sources will be in English, and then there are the traditional original languages. So you don't have to feel that you have to have any kind of particular background, but There are plenty of material from the Talmud and the Midrashim that if that's an area that you also want to go into in greater depth, that's something that I would certainly encourage, or something related to your concentration. Okay, so I want the paper to be a way for you to stimulate your own thought and move in a new direction through the phenomenology and the structures of what a question is in culture, and using both the broader question of issues. I would also say that, although I didn't put it down here, and I can give you some references, those of you who are aware of Merleau-Ponty are also aware that the question is fundamental to his philosophy as well, particularly in the more recent posthumous edition of Visible and Invisible, but there are many other issues where he talks about the human structure of the questioning self. Yeah.
Would you please spell his name?
Yeah. Merleau-Ponty? This is Maurice Merleau-Ponty. But it already begins with his philosophy of perception, but even in the later one, the issue of the question emerges as a very salient tool. So those who are interested in philosophy or phenomenology, there is that, and then any of the other things that you're dealing with. All right, so I think that the purpose of the prompt papers is really for you to key in on some issue that excites you during the course of the term that you really want to just begin to get your head around, or to kind of formulate questions about the questions. In other words, they should be coherent within the 2 pages, but they don't have to be worked out papers. But they should just be ways that you can come to class with a little bit more forethought than you might ordinarily have done. Hopefully it'll be something that's puzzling you, or something that you have a pushback against and you want to give a reaction to. So is there any question on that? Okay. Yeah, please. Yeah.
2 logistical questions.
Okay.
Do we email you the papers like the night?
No, bring them. You can bring them. You bring them into the class. That'll be fine. Yeah, I'm better that way with hard copies.
Okay. I suppose related.
I'm a little bit old-fashioned that way. So. It's okay with you.
In order to meet with you, should we just like ask you to start meeting?
Yeah, I'm here almost a full day on Wednesdays and Thursdays. So the best time to see me would be before class, anytime probably after 1 o'clock till 3, or even after class on the Wednesday. Sometimes I'll be coming in much earlier. Like today I was here very early. And Thursday I have a morning class, so I'd be free from about late morning through the early afternoon. So that gives you plenty of time.
On Wednesday?
On Wednesday, it'll be from like about 12 o'clock till 3, if we can work something out. And on Tuesdays, it would be either late morning, but up till class. And if you can't make any other times, we can meet right after class, okay? So there'll be plenty of time to meet. And I encourage you, as you're thinking and as you're doing things, you don't have to wait till your final paper to come and speak to me about something that you're thinking about. All right. For the readings for today, we're going to be dealing with some of the primary sources that are listed in meeting number 1 during today, except we'll look at about 2 or 3 pages from Gadamer. The rest you can read on chalk. And the Straus, he was a very important philosophical, I guess his phenomenological psychology, but he did very important studies on the structure of the person, the upright body, walking, perception. He did some very important studies. There has never been a kind of major study on his work, but he's an extremely important phenomenologist of the anthropological nature of the self. And then this was a very fundamental, these are all translated from the German, so the questioning being is a major essay. And then for the next 2 classes after this, we're going to deal with the book of Job. Okay? So the first one will be through the first 27 chapters, really through the cycle of the debates. And what I really want you to do for that is to begin to isolate what are the kinds of questions Right? What is the kind of the structure, the nature of the questions? What do they pose? The kind of problems? How is that book built around a numerous series of both answerable and unanswerable questions as we go through that? So that will sort of set a certain kind of fundamental frame to our inquiry. So what I want to do to begin with is really several things. I want to begin by just opening up a series of philosophical or phenomenological issues about the nature of what a question is, just so that we can begin to open that issue up. Then I do want to read with you a couple of pages from Gadamer so that you can see a very different sustained reflection on those issues. And then we'll take a look at a variety of sources, mostly from the Hebrew Bible, and then one from rabbinic literature, just as a way for us to kind of warm up and that you can kind of begin to apply some of the statements we're talking about today to begin to feel your way into the nature of the questions. Okay? So anybody want to ask anything of a technical or a speculative issue? All right. So the task of the course is to explore the structure of the question. That is to say, the structure of wonderment, the structure of the open query, the structure of puzzlement, provocation, confusion, or downright ignorance. So how does the question open up a space of inquiry of different sorts by the way the question is posed? And obviously the way a series of questions will be posed in a particular book, either rhetorical or otherwise, inform the way that culture or those particular texts think. So we're trying to get at how the mind of thinking, particularly in cultures and especially Judaism, where different kinds of questions get thought moving or structure thought or structure the notion of truth or inquiry. Okay, so we'll see in a whole variety of different genres. So the first part of what we're going to deal with momentarily is the general phenomenology or anthropology of the question. So that really wants to open up the notion of the question in the broadest sense of what it means to be a human being who asks questions. That will be the general inquiry, and then we're gradually going to make a more, what we call a more regional inquiry into the specifics of questions along a whole variety of genres in Judaism, and increasingly get more complex and try to establish that. So we'll eventually want to see what the role and function of questions in Jewish sources are from classical antiquity to the present, and to see how the question generates thought, generates discourse, generates ideas. Those of you who are familiar with rabbinic literature obviously are aware how questions and back and forth questions structure the notion of what an idea or a framework is. So now we want to kind of go a little bit deeper and try to find out how that deals with issues. So the question, at the phenomenological level, the question opens a space. Firstly, it opens a space within the self. The self becomes aware of something that it lacks. At the very first level, it's the opening of a lack that needs to be filled. At the second level, it opens a space between the self and the world. There's something between the self and the world where there's a gap that needs to be overcome, that the question creates that space, or the felt space is now formulated in language, and that language then widens the space of what it means to be a self in the world with a question. And at the more broadest level, between the self and existence or being itself. In other words, broadening out from the self in relationship to itself and its own purposes, its own desire for knowledge, between the self and the world of nature, the world of things, the social world, and then, of course, the larger questions of existence, being, God, however we want to see those kind of questions, and the way the particular posing of that question affects things. So the issues will be with the facticity of a question, like what does something mean? How is the self posited in relationship to that question? The self it's not just only the positing of a question, but the self is posited in a certain way in relationship to existence or being or another person. It could be hierarchical, it could be horizontal, and it establishes a certain relationship between selves or between generations, as we'll see when, for example, the question of tradition, how a question is opened up because something of a preceding generation is not known or doesn't make any sense, and then there's a need to overcome this hermeneutical gap or this gap of understanding. We'll also have to take a look at what the role of the rhetorical question is. What is it? What is its function? How does it work? And then, of course, the question that we'll see shortly as a kind of a cri de coeur, kind of a cry where the self is in despair because answers don't seem to be available, and yet there is a need for some kind of an answer. So the self places itself in a kind of situation of anxiety or pain or despair on the relationship to a certain kind of question. As we move forward, we'll also see in what sense the self is a seeker. The self who wants to seek an answer, or is the reality of the question posed by existence itself. So there's a question that emerges from the inner structure of the self, and the self as a seeking being, and then there are issues that are posed to the self from the outside world of what things seem to be or what they could be. And as we'll see momentarily with Gadamer, this opens up a structure of conversation. The question and answer structure opens up a discourse between the one and the other. Let me just make a couple of more phenomenological statements based on a whole variety of different reflections. So, a first issue that I want to pose is the question is a primary self-validating act which opens up a space of possibility. So whatever else a question begins to do, the self becomes, at a certain level, aware of itself. It validates itself in relationship to something unknown. And it opens up a space of possibilities which are not yet known, which may be structured by what imposes itself on the questioning itself, or on the basis of one's cognitive abilities, or the basis of what one is absorbed by tradition. So we'll have to see in what ways, particularly when we get to the book of Job, how one is forced to think about questions, as we would say today, out of the box. You have to kind of get a question that takes you into a different cognitive frame, because this sort of stuckness is a certain kind of way. Or it can be positing the question, for those who are involved in general philosophy, the particular ironic nature of the Socratic question. So the philosopher poses the question, but it's not a real question. It's a way of dialectically bringing the other person into a different state of comprehension. So the questioner can open up a space of real possibility by a stance of greater knowledge or greater security in relationship to something. And then the question could be designed to undermine a false sense of knowledge, or to open up a new question in the person who's addressed. So the role of question, particularly in the Socratic question, is to open up an ironic debate because the initial question is not a real question, it's a pseudo-question. It's a question from which the questioner knows the answer, but it's designed to create questions in the listener. So this has, of course, obviously had such fundamental significance in Western thought, and actually there hasn't been even a comparative phenomenology of the relationship between the Socratic question and the Rabbinic question in Talmudic literature. Given certain kinds of issues, it would be very interesting to see how different cultures think abstractly or concretely or raise issues by this comparative notion of the question. So this, in relationship to this obviously poses a very different notion of what ignorance is, right? If it's a real question, real ignorance is a driving force. There's a desire to overcome something that seems to be either obscure or secret or on the other side of present knowledge. Whereas from the classical notion of the Socratic question, ignorance is a feature of false knowledge. Okay? So these are fundamental features of our civilizations, and I'm sure that these issues are raised even more ironically as we're talking. Those of you, many of the issues have been translated, but a kind of more ironic notion playing between the kind of the Western and the Rabbinic notion. I don't know if is the name Edmund Jabez known to any of you. Okay, so the kind of a modern sort of French Jewish thinker of the past generation, lived in Jabez, Jabez. But he wrote several very ironic books on the notion of the question, really both from the point of view of himself being post-Holocaust or Jewish exile from Morocco in Egypt. But this notion of undermining the self's own ability to posit a question becomes this issue of Jabez. So these kind of issues so far raise the question of what the subjectivity of the self who asks the question is. Is it a superior ironic knowledge? Is it a humble request for greater information? What is the dialectic between the student and the teacher, or the teacher in relationship to the student from that point of view? A second larger category, for lack of a better term, is the question, in a certain sense, is the birth of eros, in the kind of Platonic sense. It's the birth of desire. It's the desire for understanding. It's the desire for some completer cognizance of things. In the Western sense, it's the desire for knowledge, the yearning for knowledge, as the structure might unfold in the symposium, for example. So eros, in that sense of being that drive, that yearning for filling in gaps, for taking in larger circles of understanding. That would be this from a certain point of view, or at least from the point of view of Aristotle and even from Plato, eros is opened up by a space of wonder, right? So something stimulates, is a lure to understanding. Something is a lure or a stimulus towards eros in the cognitive sense, and there's that longing. So there's this longing and the sense of the process of knowledge as that part of that eros. So the symposium, of course, is the classical structure of that, moving through a series of desires and a series of questions beyond the conceptual to a much larger sense of this. This also raises within that framework the notion of anticipation. Right? The question in relationship to eros opens up a structure that's fundamental for what it means to be a person, the notion of the hope, of the anticipation of an ending, right? Kermode has a fundamental, I don't know if the name Frank Kermode, who used to be taught Shakespeare at Columbia, but among his many books, one is called The Sense of an Ending. So a query opens up some kind of a sense of telos, or an anticipation, right? This notion of hope. The query is built into that. A third aspect that will require a certain notion is what Gadamer will call the horizon of understanding. So, and the question begins, or the problem, or the difficulty is when it establishes a space of what Gadamer would call a horizon of understanding. We work within a certain horizon of conceptual ability. So the series of questions try to push that horizon into another dimension, try to open up the horizon, try to widen the space of the epistemic structure of what a question is. The horizon is not something fixed, but a horizon is something that's established empirically in the world. What is this? What is that? And then there's a question to kind of widen that space of the horizon. So it's a cognitive frame in many ways for Gadamer. It's not a fixed thing as if there is a horizon out there and it has some kind of substantive aspect. But the horizon serves to be that broader cognitive framework which both limits and stimulates the possibility of what a question can be, and then how that configuration can change. I think we want to reflect as well, not just on the eros of the question, but what the power or the empowerment that the question does from an educational point of view, to give the person the power to ask a question, the power in the social structure to open up new spheres of knowledge. In certain kind of cultures, the ability to, or the power or the empowerment to raise a question is limited. So that notion of question as a source of power and a source of empowerment opens up a framework of freedom, right? It's not just the hope and the anticipation, but the notion of the question gives a certain notion of the sense of freedom. I would also just, we can leave at this framework, but since it was already raised in the sense of the horizon, the question of ever receding and opening questions from the factive to the conceptual to the larger sense of being. So the questions are constantly in a state of process and opening. And then the question would be, how do certain teachers, how do certain questions, how do certain genres limit the question? Or if a question in certain forms of rabbinic literature, there are only certain ways that questions can be posed, or the questions are opened up in a certain way, they narrow and they focus what would be the opening. I think it's important for us to see that not only in terms of the genres that we share, but in terms of the world that we share also as contemporaries, that the multiple genres that we live in open up multiple questions, and these produce part of the complexity of the self, and the notion of integration becomes that larger. It's not simply the ever-receding horizon of questions, but the perplexity of whether these can be integrated in any kind of sensible way, or one is limited by the vector of a specific question or the vector of a particular whole, and then you either choose to live within one dominant cultural vector with its own multiple genres with other kinds of things, or you try to be open to multiple things. Obviously, within a traditional society, it's a lot easier when there are normative kinds of questions or normative goals that one wants to solve on the basis of the question. I think we'll leave open at this point the larger question of certain kinds of answers being either esoteric, so that they require a special development of knowledge. The whole notion of philosophical or other forms of esotericism means that different kinds of questions have to be posed towards text or reality on the assumption that there's something hidden behind the surface of a text or hidden behind the surface of the world, and that would also affect the nature of the answer. So we're more inclined to think of answers of people who have natural reason or philosophical reason, but of course there's a whole spectrum of not only spiritual answers but revelatory answers, divinatory answers, answers of divine revelation and so on, or special esoteric wisdom that comes as an answer to a certain type of posed question. So that whole spectrum of what divination means, taking the sense of divination in the broad metaphorical sense of Schleiermacher, right? Divination begins with simply asking certain kinds of questions, but it can be questions about the natural world, about the kinds of strange configurations on a liver, or the alignment of the stars. Those are certain kinds of ways to pose questions of different types of correlation, right? So we won't necessarily in this class take a look at that, but the very structuring of magical divination or divination in the ancient world are really attempts to create correlations of an answer that is not posed by the immediate sense, but by the configurations of things in the world. They're posing some kind of truth behind the world about the future, about the nature of one's destiny, and so on. These are fundamental to human civilization. The hermeneutic question, which is either an explanatory or a question of understanding, is a highly rationalized notion as opposed to, say, what it means to inquire or to divine things, to what degree the lines on your hand or the lines on a liver or a sheep's the size or oddities in animals are not, these are considered to be complex forms of script in the ancient world. So divination are dealing with different forms of script. God doesn't necessarily write an alphabet in all cases. God can write in all kinds of strange configurations on leaves, or the relationship between lines and things like that. And the person who knows the answer would be able to interpret a more cryptic script. So even the notion of being able to ask the question that does this have an answer might require a whole tradition, a presumption that these things do have real meaning and real answers in a particular culture. So does anybody want to pick up on any of the broad topics that I've just mentioned? I think a lot of these have subtopics, but any of these kind of issues just pose anything initially towards you that you want to pick up on, or anything that it stimulates you to kind of think about in terms of Yeah, Tzvi.
With regard, you mentioned the notion of anticipation, especially with regard to the Platonic battles. What do you argue for the distinction between the Greek tradition with regard to the question in the sense that the Eros never attempts to really achieve the goal? I mean, the ideas are always there to always kind of try to long and to always try to achieve, but never to be able to really achieve those very goals.
So in that sense, there would either be there's a structure of longing, right? So the infinite, not only the infinite conversation, but the infinite question. But there may be a notion that at a certain point, whether it's in the symposium, or it may even be for the whole structure of question and answer for Aquinas, the ultimate realization, the answer becomes something non-cognitive or non-descriptive, and it becomes an illuminative answer. So the question is whether the answer is always related to that question, or there becomes a point where you reach the limit of the certain posing of the question. We're going to see when we deal with the book of Job. There'll be several key turning points in the book of Job where a certain structure of question reach a dead end. And the very genre of the question will have to repose a new type of way of approach towards that question, not because the assumption is but that the question simply spins its own wheels. But certainly that notion that you're raising, Tzvi, about the issue of eros, there are cultures in which that is the task of the self, to constantly ask and to be able to reformulate that in a kind of ongoing goal of gnosis, of knowledge that lies way beyond, on the assumption that there is no person or specific person who has that kind of revealed or superordinate wisdom to answer a kind of question, right? So the task becomes a human destiny, becomes a project of the self. Not just, from that point of view, the difference is not just knowing an answer to solve a pragmatic question, but the notion of questioning an answer becomes a definition of the self quest into the mystery of understanding, right? So there's a very different notion of what the goal and the quest of the self is, not simply to master certain kind of techniques and to reassemble and ask questions for a technological answer or a pragmatic answer, but that the very nature of the self is interminably bound to this kind of spiritual exercise of questioning. So then it becomes a spiritual exercise of a certain source, right? But there would also be built in an anticipation of either wisdom as processual along the way, or wisdom as the ultimate goal, right? In other words, there have to be some kind of a telos of the self yearning, right? It's not, there would be an incremental notion of wisdom rather than simply a series of new questions that you start your engine every single day and drive in a new direction. But this is a notion that the spiritual exercise of the question enlarges the mind and enlarges the focus, but it is built in to, if not a notion of ultimate rationality in existence, at least a notion of an ultimate telos. Whether, of course, in the Greek tradition, it would be to have a divine wisdom, right? A supernal, or at least the wisdom of the active intellect, the kind of the lower angel. But it would be an illumination, because that tenth sphere would not necessarily be the wisdom of God, but the wisdom of God that is empowered into the active intellect, which is an angelic wisdom, right? But to be able to have the mind conform to that would be so. In other words, it relates to this larger notion that these forms of education and questioning have certain prescriptive notions. There has to be some notion of an ending, even if it's beyond understanding. Otherwise, these things would then collapse upon themselves. So there is a kind of optimism built into that form of question.
You're always maintaining tension.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
You've referred to this a couple of
I
times.
see.
Sorry, you referred to, I only know Jabez by name only.
Right.
But are we going to be kind of exploring the tension between religious modes of questioning that do in some way require an answer, or at least a process that is moving towards an answer, even if it ultimately remains a process, versus an ironic mode of questioning in literature where the whole structure can be allowed to collapse, or where that makes a certain different kind of point?
Oh, so I think that's your question. I think that's that would be something that you might bear in mind. I mean, the function of, just to stay with your topic, the way questions are posed, not only in Jabez, but the way questions are posed in Kafka, and how the questions become ironic, imploding questions, and one doesn't know who to ask the right question to, or who to address the question to. Blanchot is then a good site, this infinite question, the infinite conversation, because he's very much a crossing of these French and German and modern traditions. So that, I think, the way you just posed that could be a project that you need to be thinking about. Is there? The question is whether a religious question can also be ironic. In other words, if the religious question, then we're talking about a koan, right? Right? That's a question that breaks itself open because it has an operatic question, right? It doesn't have an answer, but it's the impossibility of the question that breaks the mind open in a different way. So that would be so there could be the ironic notion of the question of Kafka, where there's a dizzying notion, and the reader who reading that then becomes a spiritual exercise of its own. He's not only confessing to his own structure, but when literature formulates that, the literature that formulates that obviously wants the reader to become convoluted in a specific way, either because that's describing the unanswerability of questions, or because through that one, part of the irony, as long as you're thinking that, maybe you remember the famous parable. Maybe I'll photocopy and we can look at it together. In Kafka that appears in the trial, but also separately before the law, right? Everybody remember that kind of episode where a person comes and he stands and he's waiting for people to come before the law to ask the right question, to know how to enter in across the boundary, the question, and then at the very end, he asks, "How come no one has come here?" It's because this is only your question. This only door was meant for you, and now I'm going to close it. So it's.
This is not the process.
No, it's called before the law. Maybe I'll even try to bring it in at a certain point. But in other words, there's only one question that you have, and if you haven't got to the point that you can ask your question, the whole life then is to begin to formulate a question, but you don't know when the right time to ask that question is. So these are making things even more complicated, and it may be that we might want to, towards the end of the term, we have a couple of other things planned. I'd be happy to bring in some of these more ironic things of Jabez, his notion. He has a whole book on the Book of Questions. Are you aware of that? He has a whole, and some of that's been translated by the 3 volumes called the Book of Questions. And it's a kind of ironic play on the Talmudic discourse. So maybe I'll do something of that. Maybe I'll bring some of that in. I hadn't thought of that, but since we'll be looking at some of the Talmudic things, it sort of turns the Talmudic form of give and take inside out, from only the way a kind of the most ironic modern person could have done that. And it would only make sense because question becomes a fundamental feature of the Jewish mentality as he is trying to struggle with it. Okay? So I think those would be interesting things. I think you're beginning to see that the religious question, the philosophical question, can be multiple, but they can be one question, and they can be very complicated ways to become a form of spiritual ritual process. Right? So certainly in the Greek world, the Academy of the Question is a form, it's a ritual process. The education is a ritual process of a certain kind of wisdom. To know what you don't know becomes the answer, becomes a wisdom, as opposed to having some kind of an answer that you have as a kind of a portmanteau that you carry around and say, well, now I can go into my iPad and I can figure out the question. I know the portal, right? That kind of a thing. Okay. Anybody else want to? Yeah, please.
We'll be dealing with questions asked by God to man and the symmetry between the knowledge of that question and the questions asked by man to God.
Yes, we'll actually see some of that today already. The Job will, of course, be a pivotal case of that, and it will be. But that could be a subject of your own series of questions in relationship to what you're studying. But we will see a number of those kinds of questions. Obviously, I'm trying to make a small sample of questions because we can only look at so many texts each week. And I wanted to touch on different genres. But the way different genres do things and what it means to be in a culture with multiple genres that are asking different kinds of questions at different moments in one's day or in one's life or for different purposes. Kind of cultures want to give you a sense that there is a cohesion. I think it's a little bit more complicated for the modern self. Yeah.
You mentioned the Talmud earlier. So while the Talmud has a form of asking questions, the answer has various answers given have their own reflections on the question. And so, for example, a minority opinion could be viewed as...
Absolutely. So then the question would be, what does a culture do with the triage of questions? How do you stop the cycle of questions? In other words, if the issue is to find out a question that's posed, to see a series of legal or potential implications, and then that's closed off when the implications become available, or how you deal with these kinds of branching questions, right? That issue of the branching question. Or the question that's posed by, let's say, we'll see towards the end questions, the whole genre of she'elot tshuvot, of the responsa literature. So you have questions posed by the real world, but have to be answered in terms of a very hierarchy of particular knowledge, right? In terms of certain precedents. So there's a kind of odd relationship. But the assumption is that the answers, there's a relationship between the oddities in the world that then are related to a series of structures that would provide a certain way of dealing with that. It's a whole other complicated and cultural notion, but it's fundamental for a religion like Judaism or Catholicism and so on, where there is the world, presumably a world of divine creation, and then there is the structure of normative law. And then you have the oddities of both, how do you create a homology or a correlation between the two. So those are very important cultural issues. And as I'm saying, that we don't have any of the things that we're going to be going forward. We don't have a phenomenology of this. We don't have even minimum studies of what the real implications are. You'd even think there's not even a full study in rabbinic literature, not only of the rabbinic series of questions, but a whole a cognitive phenomenology of the responsum. Right? Where does it stand in relationship to even to the divinatory question? Like, you take the odd circumstance that has to be correlated with a normative structure. That whole issue, which is absolutely fundamental, let us say, to the legal mind of Judaism, has never been explored in both a philosophical or a generic sense and things like that. So hopefully some of these things might stimulate some of you who have different interests to go in different directions. Let us go to Mr. Gadamer first. What I've done is I've taken a series of small units from his Truth and Method that we can read together just as a way of deepening our first steps into the issue today. And then for the last part, we'll take a look at a series of sources. So the first one, you can see, is bracketed off from page 266 to 267. So who would like to read this? This is Gadamer was a student of Heidegger. Heidegger's fundamental issue of method is posing the question. And Gadamer's major issue is to see how questions become questions and answers in conversations. Okay, so we want to be able to see what is involved here in his particular phenomenology or the hermeneutics of the question as he wants to unfold this. So who would like to read from the bottom of those two paragraphs out loud, and we can maybe talk about this. Anybody want to? Yeah, great. Okay.
From the essence of the question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The essence of the question is the opening up and keeping open of possibilities.
Okay, so here you have a very fundamental sentence for this notion of philosophical hermeneutics. I didn't pose it exactly in that way in my opening phenomenon, but because I wanted to leave room for his issues. But it's an opening up and keeping it open, right? So it's not that the answer is not an answer, but that it opens up further possibilities. Okay, so that becomes for him a structure of mind of a certain form of the question, to keep things open internally as a hermeneutical quest. Okay, let's go on.
If a prejudice becomes questionable in view of what another or a text says to us, this does not mean that it is simply set aside and the other writing or the other person accepted as valid in its place. It shows rather the naivety of historical objectivism to accept this disregarding of ourselves as what actually happened.
So what is he posing here by in terms of the prejudice that is being undermined? What does he see? Why does this sentence seem to follow from the preceding one?
What's the presupposition that encounters difference, right? So under a worldview, regardless of whether or not conscious, that encounters a totally separate worldview, and rather than ignoring it or replacing it, using it as a replacement, opens a conversation.
Right. So here, in a sense, you should think of the word prejudice not in the negative sense, but a prior judgment, a prejudgment. So it relates in a certain sense to the notion of a horizon. So in other words, if I come to a text and all of a sudden I realize that this is breaking open my thinking. What he is trying to tell you is that before that happened, I was stuck in a certain notion of a naivete of historical objectivism, a historicism, that my mind and the text are homologous, they're the same thing, and that I can understand that. And he's trying to say, no, you're being opened up to the notion of historicity, right? You're a notion that different texts are reflective of different cognitive structures, even though you're going to always read it from within the horizon of your own understanding, but you're aware that there's something there that doesn't conform to your mind, and that opens up the notion of the historical nature of being, and not that meaning is already there in a permanent sense. And that's an important issue that he wants to be pushing. Okay, let's go on. It shows rather the naivete of historical objectivism, what we would call historicism. To accept this disregarding of ourselves is what actually happens. That is to say, of our fundamental involvement in the construction of meaning and the construction of the question. And that we realize that in trying to get your mind around the subject matter, you're being forced to ask questions that you hadn't thought of before in relationship to that give and take with the textual given. Okay? Let's go on.
In fact, our own prejudice is properly brought into play through its being at risk.
Right. So in other words, he wants to emphasize the fact, what? That we become transparent to ourselves, right? For him, that hermeneutical process is fundamental. You become transparent and aware of yourself as a thinking, asking being. Okay.
Only through its being given full play is it able to experience the other's claim to truth and make it possible for he himself to have full play. The naivete of so-called historicism consists in the fact that it does not undertake this reflection, and in trusting to its own methodological approach forgets its own historicality. We must here appeal from a badly understood historical thinking to one that can better perform the task of understanding. True historical thinking must take account of its own historicality. Only then will it not chase the phantom of an historical object, which is the object of progressive research, but learn to see in the object the counterpart of itself, and hence to understand both. The true historical object is not an object at all, but the unity of the one and the other, a relationship in which exists both the reality of history and the reality of historical understanding. A proper hermeneutics would have to demonstrate the effectivity of history within understanding itself. I shall refer to this as effective history. Understanding is essentially an effective historical relation.
So what is he saying?
But I have a question.
Okay, good. Okay.
Sorry, is this written before or after natural writing history?
This was written in the early. He published this in 1960.
Okay.
That's after it.
Yeah, right. It's after. It's after. Yeah. So he actually had a series of debates with Straus.
Okay.
If you're interested in that issue, Straus had a response to Truth and Method. There's a whole series of back and forth. I think some of that, I'll get you the exact references. There was a journal called Interpretation.
Yeah.
And there's a series of discussions about this very problematic. They went back and forth in several cases. So why did you particularly...
Just because it's a very straightforward reading of his critique of historicism seems to be the same as Straus's in natural written history, so that's why I asked.
Mm-hmm.
I'm stuck in the naivete of historicism, so I was wondering if
So I think that needs to be, so that, that could be some kind of a prompt thing that you could begin to work out, where Gadamer stands vis-a-vis Straus on these issues. and limits and the possibilities. I'll make a note to get that reference from from interpretation, so in case you're interested. But you can see that what he's trying to kind of bypass is the self being totally constituted and the object being totally constituted, right? That there is an entwinement, and that awareness of how the self is put into play in particular relationship with the textual object, and how the textual object puts the self in play, creates meaning in the between. That is actually or it's between the two. It's actually an issue that we'll see that's fundamental to Ricoeur, but Ricoeur doesn't actually refer to Gadamer in that sense, that the meaning is taking place in that space between the two, and that the notion that there's a fully formed cognitive self and a full text, and that there is a divining of that text in a certain sense is being resisted by Gadamer, and that both the text and the reader are putting each other into play, and that back and forth is part of what he wants to understand to be understanding, right?
So just to clarify, so when he talks about historicism, he's talking about something that's really denying that.
Yes, exactly, right. Like that it's really there, and that there's something objective that one could, if one were able, let's say, either to deny, either to overcome your prejudice, or in a Schleiermachian sense, to have the proper empathetic identification with the mind of the author. There would be Schleiermach. So in that sense, Schleiermach's or the romantic notion is either through empathetic understanding we could get to the intention of the author, or in this particular case that there is objective truth that one could actually come through a kind of historical positivism. Here, he is trying to fundamentally undermine that particular notion. So this would be a very interesting way that you might want to kind of bring these two things into conversation. Anybody else want to pick up on anything here? Yeah, please.
I'm not sure I understand who is the reacting to, but it's a little bit of a strong argument of what historicism is. It's he paints something that it's historians in a state were not longer thinking and writing like Ranke.
Right.
And he's attacking some sort of German historical writing that could have been very, accepted in the 19th century, but certainly not at the time he was writing. And that's...
Well, I think you have to kind of see it from the whole first part of his book is a kind of rethinking of people, not only Ranke, but Droysen, others. But I think you're right, that this is a kind of spoof. It's not as wie es gewesen war, the way it was, as if there was some kind of a fixed notion of the way it was. So the bringing this into conversation with the critiques of historicism of Popper and others would be a very interesting issue. The question is, can he be wrong in the critique of historicism and basically on interesting philosophical grounds by where he wants to go, right? In other words, the fact that he may be making a caricature of a certain form of historicism may not necessarily undermine his argument as well, but one would have to kind of parse that out a little bit. But here we're just jumping into this, and you can go, if you've read the first part of Truth and Method, or if you choose to, then you can see he does want to go through historical authors from a certain point of view. But you're right, this is the way it's formulated. Your question is absolutely Right, like who is he think he's talking to at the point that this question is being raised? Yes. So let's now jump to 325 to see at the top of 326 where he's using the model of the Platonic dialectic, something that I already hinted at before. So who wants to read this, or do you want to keep on reading? Anybody can. Okay, please. Yeah. This indicates.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just saying, pick up with this indicates.
This indicates the direction of our inquiry. We shall now examine the logical structure of openness, which characterizes hermeneutical consciousness, recalling the importance of the concept of the question.
Okay, so the question then is that which creates openness, right? So now he wants to push this in a very particular way.
As discovered in our analysis of the hermeneutical situation, it is clear that the structure of the question is implicit in all experience. We cannot have experiences without asking questions. The recognition that an object is different and not as we first thought obviously involves a question whether it was this or that. The openness that is part of experience is, from a logical point of view, precisely the openness of being this or that. It has the structure of a question. And just as the dialectical negativity of experience found its fulfillment in the idea of a perfect experience, in which we become aware of our absolute finitude and limited being, the logical form of the question and the negativity that is part of it find a fulfillment in a radical negativity, the knowledge of not knowing.
Right. So he's not taking up that Socratic issue, but embedding it in the true notion of, from his point of view, of what the hermeneutic quest is. So the hermeneutic quest is always, in Heideggerian terms, is always already trying to determine this or that, and trying, notice that being is already posing questions to you that you're answering, and that you're also involved in a ceaseless question. So that becomes the foundation of the hermeneutic experience, to be constantly in this form of thinking through, of sorting out, of discriminating, of delimiting. That open-ended process without a ground to it, which is grounded in the question, as it were, generated by the question, is the ongoing aspect, so that every move opens up a notion of a not knowing. So there is no, this is the self in relationship to the self. Right? The self is constantly achieving the wisdom of the awareness of a receding or expanding horizon, right? So that we might say. So this knowledge of not knowing, to find fulfillment in a radical negativity, right? So here he's introducing hermeneutics in his own form of dialectical form of thinking, right? The perception of positivity induces the question of what that is, and in the space of the negative, the movement, it's not necessarily a synthesis, but the movement forward is to realize it undermines the substantiality of what had been thought to be cognitively fixed. So this will become a new type of self, a new type of cognitive way of being. Let's go on.
This is the famous Socratic docta ignorantia, which opens up the way amid the most extreme negativity, doubt, and true superiority of questioning. We shall have to consider in greater depth what is the essence of the question, if we are to clarify the particular nature of the hermeneutical experience. It is of the essence of the question to have sense, Now, sense involves direction. Hence, the sense of the question is direction in which alone the answer can be given if it is to be meaningful. Question places that which is questioned within a particular perspective. The emergence of the question opens up, as it were, the being of the object. Hence, the logos that sets out this opened up being is already an answer. Its sense lies in the sense of the question.
Right. This is, I think, very profound.
Yeah.
Anybody want to kind of pick up on this or a response to this?
I'm just wondering to what extent this corresponds, if at all, with Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. Barthes calls for taking it out of the context of the historical or cultural context, creating yet another gap or another space of ignorance or lack of knowledge, and so approaching the understanding of the text as is.
Well, I think that I'm not sure how that is exactly related to this paragraph. It certainly relates to the preceding one in the sense that that the critic becomes an author, the reader becomes an author in a certain sense. The text is not sufficient on its own, but in the reading one is composing, one is thinking.
Very Foucaultian
Yes.
response.
Here, I think this notion that I was alluding to at the beginning of the sense that there's an implied telos, there's an implied directionality of thinking. There is both, and also that the self that poses is grounded through the notion of the question and the notion that the question is going in some direction. So he's trying to give us a kind of phenomenology of the structure of what happens when you ask. So it not only opens up a space, but within that empty space is a pointing, right? There's a directionality of possibility. So that, and I think that's what he is. That's the logos that sets out on this opened up is already an answer, right? So that you're already caught up that the logos, that there is some kind of rational structure, is an answer that's already undermined in the answering, right? So there's no final answer to the question, but it's interesting that the logos that is answering is a question, but it's also an answer, and it gives one that hope that there is some kind of directionality to thought, right? That it's not just scattered, it's a particular focusing. So the question then has to be understood from that point of view as a focusing, right? A focalizing of multiple possibilities. Yeah.
Is it an answer in the sense that it kind of serves as an indicative kind of character? Well, I mean, I'm kind of reflecting on it being an object, a notion, a question, or a thing, and kind of referring to not as an object of knowledge, a determined object of knowledge, but rather something which always kind of points beyond itself. In that sense, would you say that the logos is an answer? In a sense that always kind of encourages me to relate to logos as an indicative kind of phenomenon?
I think, I'm not sure whether indicative is the thing, because it itself already is opened up by the negative space itself, right? In other words, there is a sense of an arrow going forward. There's a directionality of the question that gives some sense of the rational movement of thought, right? But I don't know whether other people. I think indicative. You mean in a sense just a pointing, a kind of directional focus.
In the sense that whatever I come across it should not be experienced by me as a present and hand kind of
something that you have.
That I have and is determined by the way it's kind of first experience and in kind of the manner of any, but rather trying to understand the content as something which kind of points beyond the content in that sense. Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of, the question was basically, you just mentioned it very close similarity between Gadamer and Heidegger. Heidegger, when he speaks about logos, when he speaks about questioning, he speaks about the fact that we come across certain phenomena that we try to emphasize. We need to kind of change our approach and experiencing the phenomena, but in the sense of experiencing those phenomena and their indicative character, in the sense that there's always a point beyond. So it's kind of the content which is present within a given.
So that would affect what we're talking about, the horizon, right?
Right.
So the horizon is a kind of, from this point of view, it's a kind of ontological dimension that doesn't exist in its own right, but it is formed in the forming of the question, right? The forming of the question creates that ontological sphere within which possibilities exist. So in that sense, there's a kind of indicative quality to it. But there's, at the same time, it's subjunctive. There's a wish, there's a hope. So it's not just. It's complicated. I would say the subjunctive is as much a feature of this as the indicative character, because the indicative character somehow would make one feel that there is some kind of an object to be gained, but it's already this. You're putting thought at risk, and the subjunctive hope, the wish, the dimension, is part of is a fundamental thing. So that becomes the difference between the closed or the fundamentalist mind and the kind of mind that he's trying to sponsor, right? Maxime.
Just a remark or a question. Your description of what happens inside the self who is asking a question, and the resilient description of what happens within divinity at the moment of the creation of the world, in the beginning of Etz Chaim, are so similar. Did you have any associations with that?
You want to say a little bit more about that?
No, I said what I said.
Yeah.
Maybe did you have any?
Well, I think you're asking a mathematical question. I mean, an infinite point that begins to.
Oh no! Of course it is influenced by your imaginary, but not what. I mean, the obvious part is this creation of free space in some direction with this free space. That's an obvious geometric association.
Yeah. I think you're asking a kind of Kabbalistic kind of question. The question of the possibility of being opens up a space in which something can take place. That would be from a Kabbalistic point.
So. Yeah. Very much so. Yeah, but of course I wouldn't be as strong as to say that Arizal would say that God is asking question by him creating the world. But after you saying that, my question is, did you think this way about, I don't know, about this, about it? I don't know.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. But let's come back to that. But I think that's kind of the more radical Kabbalistic issue, opening up the negative space. All right, let us jump to 327. This is an old conversation between Maxim is just arrived from Moscow, but
why? Because
his question is right. We'll actually, but in terms of Rabbi Nachman, we'll talk about that. Rabbi Nachman, Brasov has this notion of what he calls in the Hebrews makifin. So you have structures of mind, but you can't break through the structures of your mind, right? And you constantly have to be generated by the paradox to break out of the cognitive structure of mind, in that sense. But these are questions that Maxim asked maybe 20 years ago when he was a student here in Chicago. So it's the same question, but just slightly different.
It was 10 years.
10 years, okay. All right, let's go to 327. It feels like forever, Maxim. Okay. The openness of the question, 327. Who wants to read that? Yeah, great.
The openness of the question is not boundless. It is limited by the horizon of the question. A question which lacks this is, so to speak, floating. It becomes a question only when the fluid indeterminacy of the question in which it is pointing is overcome by a specific alternative being presented. In other words, the question has to be asked. The asking of it implies openness, but also limitation. It implies explicit establishing of presuppositions, in terms of which can be seen what still remains open. Hence, a question can be right or wrong, according as it reaches into the sphere of the truly open or fails to do so. We call a question false that does not reach the state of openness, but inhibits it by holding on to false presuppositions. It pretends to an openness and susceptibility to decision that it does not have. When if what is undecided is not distinguished or not correctly distinguished from those presuppositions that are effectively held, then it is not brought into the open and nothing can be decided.
Of course, one needs a teacher or a friend for this. The posing of this is not self-determinative, right? You wouldn't know that unless you had a certain friend or a certain teacher who could help you understand that you're asking the wrong question, right? So the notion of this presupposes not only a teacher, but a certain notion of friendship or a certain notion of conversation, right? The self in relationship to the self would get stuck, I think. Yeah. What do you think? I mean, you wouldn't know that you're pretending to openness. You wouldn't know that you have a false presupposition. Right? You have to have a certain kind. The Greek notion of an agonistic relationship of friendship. That there's a struggle. Did you really mean that? Right? Or can you, right? There has to be some resistance and pushback. Loving friendship would not do that, right? You're right, all right, I love you, just say it your way, right? There's a different notion to undermine the presupposition, right? And it's very interesting too, maybe we'll have to find some, the notion of antagonism, of the agonistic notion, even among the sages in rabbinic literature, is surprisingly harsh, in the sense of the pushing back and forth. There's a disruptive quality here. Yeah. Anybody want to pick up that's my take on this. You can't do it alone, or it would be hard to do it alone. How even the philosophical self, how would it break through without some form of resistance? And where does that resistance come from? You might say that just reading other books could begin to do it if you could allow that to have that dialectical force against your own presuppositions. But he's presupposing something here that's, I think, fundamental, that we want to kind of, the need for a teacher, the need for a friend, or the need for something other to speak back to you, right? All right, let's go into this. Is shown.
This is shown clearly in the case of the distorted question that we are so familiar with in everyday life. There can be no answer to a distorted question because it leads us only apparently, and not really, through the open state of indeterminacy in which a decision is made. We call it distorted rather than false because there is a question behind it, i.e. there is an openness intended, but it does not lie in the direction in which the distorted question is pointing. The word distorted refers to something that has moved away from the right direction. The distortedness of a question consists in the fact that it does not have any real direction, and hence any ambiguity is impossible. Similarly, we say that statements that are not exactly false but also not right are distorted. This too is determined by their sense, i.e. by their relation to the question. We cannot call them false because we detect something true about them, nor can we properly call them right because they do not correspond to any meaningful question and hence have no correct meaning unless they are themselves corrected. Sense is always the direction of a possible question. The sense of what is correct must be in accordance with the direction taken by a question.
Yeah. So I think this is something I think requires multiple rereadings to kind of really absorb this, to see how we can incorporate this problematic of the true question, the true space, the distorted question, the false question, as a form of philosophical hermeneutical living, and that we would address. It's not only a principle addressed to the self and the self's integrity, right? But it's addressed to the reading of these different genres. And I think that this, you may want to reflect on this, but the difference here that he's only alluding to, but I think is very profound, of how to distinguish between these three questions. Whether those kinds of things unfold in different ways in the Platonic dialogues, or they unfold differently in rabbinic back and forth, what becomes an improper or distorted or a question that runs up the wrong tree, things like that. Let's just read one more paragraph, then we'll take a look at a couple of other texts. 340. I just selected a number of different things that I wanted to kind of begin to kind of put some grease in the wheels about these kind of issues. Okay. You want to read this one too? Anybody want to do it?
Oh, no.
You want to read this? You don't have 340?
It's the dialectic of the question?
Yeah. You want to read? Okay. The dialectic of...
Dialectic of question and answer that was disclosed in the structure of the hermeneutical experience now permits us to state in more detail the type of consciousness that effective historical consciousness is. For the dialectic of question and answer that we demonstrated makes understanding appear as a reciprocal relationship of the same kind as conversation. It is true that a text does not speak to us in the same way as it does another person. We who are attempting to understand must ourselves make it speak. But we found that this kind of understanding, making the text speak, is not an arbitrary procedure that we undertake on our own initiative, but that as a question, it is related to the answer that is expected in the text.
So this is a very fundamental issue, right? This is fundamental.
The anticipation of an answer itself presumes that the person asking is part of the tradition and regards himself as addressed by it. This is the truth of the effective historical consciousness. It is the historically experienced consciousness that, by renouncing the chimera of perfect enlightenment, is open to the experience of history. We described its realization as the fusion of the horizons of understanding, which is what mediates between the text and its interpreter.
Okay, so this is going to become a fundamental issue when we are involved not just in conversation between persons, between questions that are posed to the world, but evoking there's a kind of interesting vicious circle that's involved, right? The self asks a question that it thinks that the text is asking, based on the presumption that the asker, myself, shares the same tradition as the text, which may be true in a broad historical sense, but may be absolutely false from a historical sense, right? In other words, I may be part of the Western canonical tradition, I may be asking a question from a certain Jewish point of view, but my cognitive gap is really... So certain fundamentalists assume that because they share the tradition, they're already asking the same question as being asked by the text. And whatever they're asking, even though whenever they say it, is already there in that old conversation, rather than this being part of an unfolding notion of the fusing of the horizons, which is part of the wisdom of the ongoing expansion of that tradition, right? As making the text speak, I think this would be it would be interesting to apply this in a different way. It just occurs to me to the dialogical situation, a kind of a Buberian situation, the dialogical situation, right? In other words, because whether the question is another person creates a reality that I have to fully respond to, or do I evoke that through conversation? And but part of the problem here is that there is not the same dialogicality between persons who can keep mutually correcting each other. The problem of textual interpretation becomes more complicated, and it would be very interesting to try to work this out philosophically, because you are asking the question of the text, and the only conversation that you really have is the conversation of other interlocutors. Let's say, forget people who might be sitting around the table, it might be the community of interpreters of the medieval period, let's say, right? But they're also asking their questions from a very limited point of view. So the notion of what a community of interpretation, something I'm going to be talking about a lot in the course tomorrow, but the community of interpreters are also people who are diversely located epistemically. So we have a real problem, and so he's trying to help us talk about this Verschmelzung, this kind of blending of horizons by that's the German term of this kind of melding, or this he talks about this fusion of horizons. In German it's really this blending, or this kind of but it really raises the question of how do you make the text speak. It raises the larger question of appropriation. He uses the term appropriation. Ricoeur uses it, but I think in a more derivative way. So this dialectic, what are you posing? The rabbis have, from a very different cognitive point of view, have a very different phrase, right? So they say the text is Omer Darsheni. The text says, interpret me, right? It's as if the text was initiating the conversation, right? But it's a very different cognitive structure than the fact that you are making, in what way does the text speak? What is the question that's being posed on the notion, what is the answer that one is expecting, or what is that horizon? The whole history of commentaries could be rethought from this dialectical point of view, right? What is the pedagogy, the answer? There's a kind of slightly vicious thing. Yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just had a question. A bit ago, it seemed like you were sort of you were trying to spell out the distinction between like the fundamentalist position and then what Gadamer is getting at. And I'm unfamiliar with this literature and what has come before this paragraph that we've just read. And it seemed to me like you were saying something like the remedy that Gadamer is proposing to the sort of like fundamentalist interpretation is like continuing dialogue with other scholars and people from like other, that's what you said, epistemic perspectives, but I'm not sure if that's what you were suggesting.
Yes, I think that the presumption of the fundamentalist mind is that you are already partaking not only of the tradition of the text, but because of a certain leap of faith or a commitment of practice or a certain kind of ideal identification, you are already asking, and in the same way, the questions that they were asking. So the question is to get yourself into the awareness. For what Gadamer would say is that something has to produce a new form of reflexivity, right? And the reflexivity means that I am asking the question of the text, right? In other words, there's an awareness that the very way that I'm framing a question is affecting the answer. even though I feel that I'm trying to ask it within a certain tradition, right? That is to say, if I want to be part of that tradition, right? The counter argument to that is actually, and I've one of the counter arguments, for example, it used to be used here in Chicago, but it could be used in a lot of other places. And I remember first hearing it actually posed this way by one of my sons, who was a classics major here, and the decision to study the classics was that you were in a larger tradition of asking questions, but it didn't implicate your life in a direct way, so that you had more space to ask life-enhancing questions. That's to say, I can't be a Greek from the time of Homer. So that if I'm asking those kind of questions, I may be able to ask life questions, and I'm in the larger framework. But since I'm not going to be a person from that period, there's a certain kind of intellectual freedom that I'm retaining than if I ask the question, let us say, from a Jewish or a Christian or another point of view where it might have implications on my life. And then my horizon shrinks a little bit, right? And so I don't have... So the question would be, from this point of view, is how do you keep that real question open and being aware that even though you're asking a question within the framework of a tradition, you're asking it, let us say, 2,000 years later, right? And your mind is not the mind of someone from the 4th century Iraq in a Babylonian academy, right? Even though the problematic is a problematic that you want to begin to think your way into. Yeah.
I'm following this. It's quite amazing that he's talking about text over and over again about history, and it doesn't even mention once the word context. It's like he's very humble when it comes to historical methods. He has this kind of unity of the one and the other relationship. It's like some sort of solipsism and lack of possibility of having any knowledge. But then when it comes to philosophy, he's very bold, and he talks about the possibility of mediation between texts, and I don't know, it's quite amazing.
You're raising a very, very interesting question, obviously, because I mean, the stronger critique that you're raising is a solipsistic issue. Right? He's creating a certain kind of bubble in which you bring what you have to the text, and all that really is significant is that cognitive frame that you've created around that text, rather than... so I think that what you're raising here is the other issue of what a historical reader has to do. So in other words, the question would be, what are the limits of achieving competence in another literature? Like you say, I have to learn the language. I want to try to learn the historical facts. All this, I have to learn certain kind of details. So there are multiple levels of what competence means. It's the rhetoric, it's the language, to whatever degree that one could acquire that. But then, that doesn't mean that I am unearthing, there's an archaeology then that I can sort of strip away the text and I have the true answer.
Thinking about it, binary, I think it's fallacious. It's not, I mean, it doesn't have to be everything or nothing. It's a process.
Right.
Nobody claimed that, turning is exactly what happened, but at least
Right. So then the question is, so then the question becomes the degree to which self-conscious reflexivity on the question that you're asking in relationship to a certain opacity of the text, because you can't get behind the text, you have to stay in front of the text, right? Although the issue of competence is to try to increase the capacity for nuanced reflection in front of the text. So you're right, but you're absolutely right, dead on to pick up the fact that he doesn't talk about that the contextual issues, which would certainly change that totally. He's too much trying to overcome the issue of historical objectivity and stripping away notions. I'm just reminded of an episode. So when I was about your age. So there was I was beginning a faculty member, and I was asked to pick up Yigal Yadin. I don't know if the name means anything. He's a famous archaeologist who had just written a book called The Art of Warfare in the Ancient Near East. And I was asked to pick him up to bring him for a lecture. So this is, you have to understand, this is late 60s, early 70s. Historical positivism was all the rage. It was so much the rage you didn't even know it was all the rage, right? It was just, that's the way it was. So he said, yeah. So there was no reflection on it. I mean, it was like science, like this was the Wissenschaft. So he said. So he said to me, he said, so Fishbane, what do you study? So at that time in my life, I was doing ancient Near Eastern languages and biblical studies, and he says, oh, so we do the same thing, Fishbane. He said, I dig in a text. I dig in the ground and I pull things out, and you do the strata of the text and you pull out things too, and we both are reconstructing. And it was stated with, and I said, yeah, I mean, yes, Professor Yadin. But it was done with a kind of lack of any consciousness of how absurd that looks to me now, decades later. It was just stated like, that's what it was. You're doing stratigraphy of texts, and I'm doing stratigraphy in the ground, and you're doing the archaeology of textuality, I'm doing archaeology in granite, and we both are finding data, right? And we put it in a museum, and we talk about it, and that's the truth, right?
Sorry, just like crudely, are you suggesting that if you have like sort of like a Straussian fundamentalist position on the right, and then like this sort of silly caricature of historicism on the left, Gadamer is trying to counter what's on the right more, and that's why he doesn't use context?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. So this already gives us some stuff to think about, right? So let this help you think a little bit more about stuff that you want to be thinking about. We have about a half hour, so I just want to, maybe we'll take a look at a couple of sources. We won't be able to look at all of them. I tried to get a variety of things. Let us take on the big packet first, because see where it says Deuteronomy 6. And I didn't bring the Hebrew here because part of the Hebrew is already in the text that follows from an early rabbinic commentary from the Mekhilta of Rabbi Ishmael. That's the Hebrew that you have there, the tractate Pisha. Okay? So let's just take a look at this as a way of raising some of the questions that, thinking about what we've been talking about in relationship to maybe two texts now for today's class, right? So let's take a look at this one. So first let's just look at from the English, and then we'll look at the text from the Rabbinic side. So who wants to just read the first part of that, of Deuteronomy 6, verse 20 and following? Okay.
When in time to come your children ask you, what mean the decrees, laws, and rules about that the Lord our God has enjoined upon you? You shall say to your children, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord brought before our eyes marvelous and destructive signs and portents in Egypt against Pharaoh and all his household. And us he freed from there, that he might take us and give us the land that he had promised on oath to our fathers. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these laws, to revere the Lord our God, for our lasting good and for our survival, as is now the case. It will be therefore to our merit before the Lord our God to observe faithfully this whole instruction, as he has commanded us.
Okay. So, who wants to open up a kind of, what will be a phenomenology of what's happening in this text? What are the structures in this text?
Well, first, it's framed. The question and answer are given as a unit. It's not an open question asked to another source.
So you have a superior voice articulating the question that will take place in another historical time, right?
Anticipating.
It's anticipating a certain kind of an answer, and it's also anticipating a break in the historical tradition, right? There is someone who knows that there will be an epistemic gap between fathers and sons, and that sons and fathers have to enter a new fusion of horizons, right? They have to overcome both an epistemic and a temporal gap. So the question that's being posed in Scripture by the superior teacher, this is not a divine question, it's a question being asked by Moses, right? So the Mosaic question is when your children ask you. So it's an assumption that children are going to be puzzled by the ways of the ancestors, right? And the initial framing of the question that is projected into the mouth of the children, right, is what is the practice that you're doing that has been enjoined upon you, right? So the self is differentiating itself from the experience of the ancestors. But somehow the next generation is not completely separate. It's at least asking the question, what in God's name are you doing? Or what are you doing? Right? So somehow it's in the historical horizon, we might say even within the tradition, but it's not yet implicating the questioner. So here we have a case where the person is asking the question within the tradition because I am my father's son and my father is doing something and I don't know why my father is doing that. So I'm part of it, but I'm separate from it at the same time. And that is assumed to be what Rosenstock-Hussey would call distemporaries. They're not contemporaries, and there's an attempt to try to create contemporaries out of people who are not contemporaries, right? So he said, and then the answer of what the master teacher is saying to the father who has to be a teacher is to create a shift in the generations, because the major shift is you shall say to your children, we were slaves, right? So there's now a presumption of what's factually inaccurate but it's trying to create a new epistemic reality. Right? So the gap between the question and the answer is already wrought in a very interesting way because the tradition has been broken, but yet the child is part of the generational tradition, but it's not part of the epistemic tradition. Right? So there is tradition and there is this cognitive gap, and the major relocation is from, in a sense, incomprehensible. The child says it happened to you, and the father says it happened to us. Right? So the answer in a certain sense doesn't make any sense. Right? Except in what sense? What is the sense that the father's answer is true even though it's false?
I mean, it's an answer which, first reading it seems like an answer which justifies their own experience rather than compelling them to take part in their own experience. But then it seems like
he's not answering yet why the child should do it. So in what sense is we see the child is yes part of it but not part of it. The father says you are yes part of it, you are not part of it, but you really were there. In what sense is the father correct paradoxically? And that makes all the sense from the rhetorical nature of the question and answer.
In a sense, he's trying to kind of establish an entire discourse on the tradition itself, which seems like he's trying to go back to himself, not in the sense that the child can actually identify with that very experience because he wasn't there, but rather trying to...
Well, is he telling you to identify with that experience? No. What is the force of us? What is the force of us?
It tells the kid that their question is wrong. I mean, it somehow limits the child's question in the sense of saying that they're asking the wrong question.
But he doesn't say that. He doesn't.
No, but I think in not giving an answer that doesn't respond to you, that right? If you ask, you have this experience in the classroom as a student all the time. You ask a professor a question, and then you don't get an answer that satisfies you. That's sort of a signal to you that you've asked the wrong question. So,
why not the faculty member didn't understand? No, I guess the thing that I would raise, I'm just curious how you would respond, because this is such a traditional back and forth, and the traditional Jewish answer is that you sonny boy, should identify imaginatively with that event, because that's what the we means. But what if you shifted that, and the father is not so, when the father says we were slaves, he is now indicating that you would not have a present if it weren't for that past.
But it also shifts
right?
the concentration.
It's a very different notion of memory, right? And he's not saying that you have to identify we with that event so that you can imaginatively reconstruct yourself as if you had gone out of Egypt, which is sort of the classical Jewish answer. But in a certain sense, it would be you would not have the freedom of asking the question if there had not been an Egypt, and you are the heir of a historical event that has made... So you are part of that event because it is a historical event that implicates you. So it is a we, not in the sense that you can imagine what it was like to have been a slave in Egypt, but your act has to be to place yourself within the historical horizon of what it means to have this task that the Father is doing. Right?
It's almost explicit in the text.
What?
It's almost explicit in the sense that it says he gave us the land, which kind of links between...
Yes. So this... Yeah, I'm saying, go ahead.
I just want to be clear. You're suggesting that the father's question introduces a notion of historical contingency into this,
or continuity.
Sure. Okay. Sure.
So what the father is saying is that the we means that you are part of my you. We are a we because this generation would not have any sense if I hadn't come out of Egypt. So in a sense, you were in Egypt conceptually from the point of view of historical consciousness, but not from the point of view of historical reality. Yeah.
Well, also the we shifts from the text, because there's the initial contrast where it's like the rules that our Lord God has enjoined upon you, and we were slaves in Egypt, which is an exclusive we. But then you get to the point where he says, after he says that he gave us the land he had promised on oath to our fathers, then the Lord commanded us to observe all these laws, to revere the Lord our God for our lasting good and for our survival, as is now the case. At this point, the we becomes inclusive.
Yes, that the son has become an heir of the destiny. It's not just that the son has to identify as if you had been a slave in Egypt, which is the traditional notion, but you are an heir to the destiny, and you wouldn't have a present if I didn't have a past. And the condition of that past implicates you in the present, and it implicates your future, so that it will be good for you in the future. In other words, there becomes an arc in which the son now also has a self-liberating interest to participate in the father's activity. What was good, what was established for the father becomes a good thing for the son in a different way.
And it's not a cause and effect relation either.
I don't think so.
Right, exactly, because the story is contrasted against the command. The command is still present, even though the story doesn't require identification. So,
Yeah, I'm trying to just come at it from a non-traditional point of view, so that you can see there's another way in which the next generation becomes an heir to the tradition, because the son could not have there is a debt. The child, put it in different terms, the child has a debt to the ancestors and now has an obligation for the future. In a totally different way than to say that you were there in Egypt, right? But so we're living out the same destiny. And that you have a future that I don't have, but it extends the historical consciousness. So the way the question is, the way the embedded question is a very different way. So now let's jump to this rabbinic. This is one of the earliest rabbinic commentaries. It's from the Mekhilta of Rabbi Ishmael. It's on your syllabus. You can see I wrote it out for you. See, Mekhilta de Rabbi Ishmael. So this is Tanaitic, so it's edited at least by around the year 210. So it's very early. And here we're going to see, this is the Hebrew text here, okay? That tractate pisha, which means okay? And what we're going to see is a series of new questions being raised about the exegetical, hermeneutical questions. And then, of course, what's going to be interesting, those you not have it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, you got it? Okay, good. All right. So what's interesting here, as you'll see in the second paragraph, is that there are 4 times that the question of the son is posed to the father in Exodus and Deuteronomy. And the rabbis try to use that as a way to talk about 4 types of pedagogy of how the answer should come back. So they structure it in a totally new way. But that's precisely because living within the tradition of continuity requires a whole new way of accessing not only the original question, but the multiple questions and how they can become a series of new reflections. Okay, so we're at a slightly different stage. So let's begin with the issue, and it shall be when thy son asks. So the first is going to be a temporal and conceptual exegesis of that question. So let's do that paragraph first. Who wants to read that? You can look at the Hebrew if you want. But notice this, Vayaki yish'alcha, when will ask you, when he, your son, will ask you, right? So there's no escaping it, right? The question is, there is going to be a direct question between the generations, all right? So that is the mise en scène. That's the setting. A directness, a challenge of the generation. So now, what do the sages say? Let's read. Anyway, sometimes, because the end of the thing is when your son asks you machar, tomorrow. So now the question is, how does a later generation try to delimit what that tomorrow is? Okay, so that's the implied question that's being asked of the text, right? We saw that you make the text speak. So the rabbis, the anonymous rabbis here, are trying to make that text speak. What does machar, tomorrow, mean? Okay, so what do they say?
Shall I read?
Yeah.
Sometimes tomorrow means the next day, and sometimes tomorrow means in the time to come. In tomorrow saying, what is this? Tomorrow means in the time to come. In by tomorrow shall this sign be, tomorrow means the next day. In tomorrow I will stand, tomorrow means the next day. In tomorrow your children might speak unto our children, tomorrow means in the time to come.
So, what is the function here of the way the questioner, the rabbinic questioner, has made the text speak by using other phrases from Scripture? How does this fit into what we've been already seeing so far? Any way that you can?
It seems to establish just a very different notions of time and continuity. Earlier we talked about fathers and sons, and it's not just direct.
So in a certain sense, what the text is trying to, what the answer, what the later generation is trying to say is, this is not just a question of you and your son tomorrow in Scripture. Scripture has a durative dimension. There's a temporality, so it's speaking for all generations to come. So the way so from the perspective of the tradition, the rabbis in the tradition who are asking the question of the text, they're making the text speak in such a way that it's not historically punctilinear then, as if it's just only tomorrow, but it's for all future time, and they are establishing that on the basis of inner biblical evidence. Okay? But it means it's an expansion of the tradition, an expansion of what the son, your son, right? So your son now becomes all of your progeny into the future. The text is now shifted from just the next generation who will go into the land, which was the first notion, but for all future generations in a durative manner. So it's because they are standing within the tradition, the posing of that, when he asks you tomorrow, that tomorrow is posed by the Moses, who is the teacher for all future generations. So you understand all generations who read that, it's addressed to you.
This is also interesting because it speaks to the question of different forms of context and genre, because it's looking for internal clues in the text that tell you which tomorrow is the next day and which tomorrow is for all time to come, and basically establishes that there are narrative moments in which tomorrow literally is going to be the next day for the particular figure, and tomorrow, which is a commandment, tomorrow, which is going to be throughout your generations.
Absolutely. Let's just quickly run through this letter part, because I'm going to have to leave about 20 after, unfortunately. So let's just read from what mean these statutes and commandments. this is slightly different from those of you who are aware of the Passover Haggada. Some of this formulation is slightly different, but some of you will have a resonance to it. Okay, who wants to read this? At least in the English. Okay, great.
Just for the next
Yeah, let's just quickly do this.
What mean the testimonies and the statutes? You find that you have to say there are 4 types of sons: the wise, the simpleton, the wicked, and the one who does not know enough to act.
Yeah, so this is based on another passage in the Mekhilta where each of the 4 queries that are raised, twice in Exodus, twice in Deuteronomy, when your son asks, the son asks a different question. And then this is reconceptualized to mean 4 types of questions which reflect 4 types of persons. So there's now a way that in the future there are going to be 4 different types, right? There's a pedagogy now of understanding that the text is really concerned with one issue, but 4 different kinds of 4 different mentalities of the way people are going to pivot themselves in relationship to the past. Okay.
The wise, what does he say? What mean the testimonies and the statutes and the ordinances which the Lord our God has commanded you? You explain to him in turn the laws of the Passover and tell him that the company is not to disband immediately after partaking of the Paschal lamb. There should follow epikomen.
Okay, so we won't go into that. So you can see already here that the answer is taking this as a real query, right? It's taking the what not as a challenge, but tell me what they are. It's an ask. The wise son wants knowledge, right? So when he says ma ha'ido, it's not like what are these to you, which would be an easy, right? He's taking it. What are they that you could bring me into the traditions so that I can be knowledgeable about you? So there's a presumption here. The father is knowledgeable of the law. The wise son wants to close the gap of the generations to have the same knowledge that the son. So it's not what mean. So instead of what mean them to you, like which we saw was the original question, like what is my relationship to this? I don't have any need for it. They're reposing that the notion of what the question of what is not what mean that, but what is the meaning of these things? Because the Hebrew is simply the mean is the translator's way to get at the intonation of an aggressive question, like what does it mean to you, right? Which was the original gap question, but the maha'idot that is being interpreted by the sages as a wise question is, tell me what they are, right? It's a more, it's an inquisitive question for knowledge. Can you see that the same question is now being construed totally differently, depending on whether you thought that the son is, go show me something, or is saying, tell me what the rules are. So the gap is already closed. He just wants to become more like the father.
But he also accepts there's a presupposition that he's playing the game that the father's playing.
Yeah. That's the wise son. He's already there. He's already part of it. So we're going to see other person. The wicked son will be differently. But the biblical question had been a disjunctive question. It's now understood as a conjunctive question, right? So it's a totally different way in which that the tradition is now construed this particular question by creating a new typology of person. So the question itself in the text is reinterpreted. It's not the original question, which was an aggressive disjunctive question. Go tell me what it's for. Yeah.
In a way, it's fixing the biblical text. In the biblical text, the son is asking what we do.
Right.
And the father is asking we why, not we what.
Right.
And so here's the answering, well, we what. And, well, the stupid...
Good, nice. That's a nice way of putting it. Okay, that's good. Yeah, good. So that's the first one. Now, the simpleton. So there's another kind of question where it says, your son asks you and he says, Mazot. Like, he doesn't. So this is, so then you have to answer that question, right? So what is the force of this? Like, what's going on here, right? You can't go into the details of wisdom. The answer is that we have been redeemed, and this is a celebration of the festival of redemption, period. Right? But not that you need to know the rules to celebrate the praxis. You just need to know that you're here, and you got here through redemption. So you don't answer him in terms of something that is cognitively beyond the reach, but just your facticity means that you got here. And that's all you need to know. Right? Okay. So, but it's already a construal of ma'azot. You could have simply, because that question could have been construed, what is this, in the same sense as what is all of this? It could be an antagonistic question, a disjunctive, or it could be a question for real knowledge. But the rabbis are trying to create a new typology of question and answer that would give a kind of holistic notion of different ways that people orient themselves in terms of time and questions, so they have themselves reinterpreted that ma'azot in a new way. Like, what's this? Right? Like, what me worry kind of thing. Okay. So what's the third question? The evil one, the Rasha, what does he say?
The wicked one, what does he say? What mean ye by this service? Because he excludes himself from the group, do thou also exclude him from the group, and say unto him, it is because of that which the Lord did for me, but not for you. Had you been there, you would not have been redeemed.
Here you go. Take that, sonny boy. Yeah, man, you want to be an adolescent wise guy? You wouldn't have you wouldn't even be here. So, but the rabbis now are trying to create a juxtaposition of in and out, we and them, here and there, and the Father answers in kind, right? Because you have created a disjunction between historical continuity, you wouldn't have even got this. So there's a kind of an ironic issue to the Son, right? Yeah, I mean, you've placed yourself in a position that, as you've been redeemed, but you wouldn't have been redeemed if you had asked that question then. So in other words, all right, so what's the final one?
As for him who does not know enough to ask, you should begin and explain to him. For it is said, and thou shalt tell thy son in that day. Okay, so what's going on here? So the person who does not know how to ask a question, at petachlo, right? You have to formulate the unstated question, right? Right? So the person who does not even know how to ask, you have to begin by saying, you shall tell your son on that day. And of course, this Haggada, you will tell us. That's like the Haggada. So the presumption is the child who needs to be told. So the father is now giving a narrative report, right? An explication of this. Okay, so in this particular case, you have to bring a person into the cycle of the tradition and the generations, because they don't even know to ask a question. Okay, so here, that's the fourth type. So here you can see the rabbis have now reconstructed, on the basis of the answers and the queries, right? So it says, if your son had asked you, then you will tell him. But there was no question that was there in that version of the biblical text. You know, so if your son asks you on this day, then you'll answer him. So because there's an absence, the rabbis have read into that, this is the cognitively empty son. So you have to find a way to bring a person across the generations to be there. And then the final one is, what does this mean? And then Rabbi Eliezer says, it's really the question is falsely
translated, how can you prove? The Hebrew is minayin ata omer, which technically speaking in Rabbinic Hebrew means from where can you prove it? Where can you establish that meaning? Okay? It's not where you can prove, but where can you show that, where can you prove that even if you are knowledgeable, you still have an obligation to discuss it? And then he goes back, what are these testimonies and statutes that this is an ongoing form of discussion? So here you see, just to round this off, you see 4 ways in which a later generation within the framework of tradition is making the text speak in such a way to consider 4 ways of either rupture or continuity between the generations, and how the parental generation should pivot itself in relationship to the next generation.
Well, it seems like ultimately there's a tendency to kind of formulate these 4 sums or 4 types of questions as reflecting 4 different, I would say, historical phases, historical time, so to speak. I mean,
that could be done as well. I think they're trying to understand what is the pedagogy of the relationship between generations, right? And how is the gap between generations closed in 4 different ways, right? And so part of this issue is how is a father taught to relate to the query of the next generation? But you can see that in all cases, the questioning is posed for the mind of the next generation, and then the rabbis reconfigure the question in 4 different ways to serve their notion of what cultural pedagogy and answer would be. So the question that they pose towards it is related to a very different series of future-oriented issues between adolescent rebellion and or adolescent conformity and so on and so forth. So here we can see that the evocation, and then each one of those changes even the way, the tone of the biblical question, the way it was posed, right? So it's not as if the questions remain stable. The position of later generations will pose the earlier questions quite differently in relationship to them. So let's stop with that. If you might want to go over the rest of the sheets for the other kind of questions. I just wanted to kind of give a kind of broad range of different kinds of queries. If you want to begin next time by any questions from those, otherwise we'll jump to the book of Job. And again, I want you to focus on the range of questions and all the implications that are raised. I think that just about the fullest range is going to be raised throughout the entirety of the book of Job. So we want to do kind of the types of questions, the phenomenology, what is happening, and what does it mean to know that's being raised in a whole variety of different settings. Okay? If anybody who wants to already produce a paper based on anything that happened in our discussion, you can simply do, this could be a reflective one, you could do that for the next time. It could even just be opening up these kinds of juxtapositions that would be of some interest. So it's just, we're just trying to get ourselves warmed up here.
Question.
Okay, yeah.
The prompt papers?
Yeah.
The 4 of them, do we choose which one?
Yeah.
Whichever 4 we want to respond.
As long as, ideally, I'd like to have it before that next discussion, so it's not triggered by that discussion. But in this particular case, we're opening up a whole series of things that you may want to do. So this would be one exception if you want to do a kind of reflection on things that we've been doing. But basically, moving forward so that it anticipates, it just gets you to come to class with some more questions in mind for the sake of the discussion. But I'm flexible about that. Because I just don't want your papers to be rehashing of the discussion that we've already had. And the basic issue is for you to think through some issues rather as a way of you stimulating your own thinking in new ways. Okay? So enjoy Job, and we'll more or less. It's a fantastic text. So.
Can someone forward me?
Yeah, would someone help Maxim about how to do the chalk? You just give him the info.
Forward, or just forward me the text. If someone.
Okay, well you can do it that way.
Yes.
All right. So I'm gonna. Do I have everybody's? Good.
Yeah.
All right.
Which is wonderful. It's great. It's a compliment, right?
Tomorrow the class is at 9.
Tomorrow, those who are coming tomorrow is 9 in room 403. Upstairs.